Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I've got a review of the Anbernic RG40XXV for you. You may have seen this one doing the rounds in the last few days and maybe even weeks on some other channels, but hey, I've got one too, and I'm going to tell you my opinion on this one. I'll keep it pretty brief and just tell you what's important to know to help you decide whether or not to pick one up for yourself. In the interest of full disclosure, this device was sent to me for review by 2retro.com. There were no strings attached, and they had no editorial input on this video, nor did they see the script or video before it went live. They didn't even ask me for a plug, but I'm going to give them a small one here anyway. Their site is at 2retro.com and they sell a bunch of different indie handhelds that are manufactured in China. This was my first experience with them, and this device came packaged very well and on the same sort of time frame as ordering direct from companies like Anbernic or AYN. Their prices are equivalent to the same models from Anbernic, however they don't have the most basic version of this device on sale as I write this. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about the RG40XXV, and I'll be covering the stock out-of-box experience for this review. I'll mention custom OSs towards the end, but the point here is to show you what you get when you buy the device with zero tweaking. Anbernic released quite a few devices from late spring to late summer this year. If you thought they were done for a while, well, you're wrong! What we have here is the Anbernic RG40XXV. It uses the same chipset that we've seen in several other Anbernic devices at this point, the all-winner H700. One of the more recent devices to use it that was very popular was the Anbernic 35XX SP. Speaking of which, here's a quick size comparison so you can see how the 4XXV compares to the 35XX SP. And of course, here's a look at the device itself. It comes in three colors, by the way: white, indigo, and transparent black. I figured I'd go crazy this time and go for the indigo. And I have to admit, it looks pretty sharp and I really like the color. One thing we'll find here that's missing from the SP is an analog thumbstick just below the D-pad, and it even has the L3 click button. But don't get too excited about it just yet. Before I get into that, let's see what we've got here. So on the front of the unit we have a 4-inch screen with almost no bezels, and I've got to tell you, this screen is gorgeous. It's still 640 by 480, which is relatively low resolution, but the color on it is just fantastic. It blows away the SP and many of Anbernic's earlier devices in the same price range. We have a pretty good D-pad, 4 action buttons, start, select, a menu button, and a single speaker finishing up the front of the unit. Overall, this looks like a super fancy Game Boy or Game Boy Color, and is a form factor Anbernic has used in other devices in the past. On the right side of the device, we have a power button at the top and a reset button just below it, and a little bit further down, a secondary micro SD card slot for ROMs. On the left side, we have volume up and down buttons, and the primary SD card slot for the operating system. On the bottom of the device, we've got a USB-C charging port and a 3.5mm headphone jack. If we swing around to the top of the device, we'll find a mini HDMI output port, along with some status LEDs. And then finally on the back, we have 4 shoulder buttons and the device info label. So overall, I really like the look of the 40XXV, especially the basically bezel-less screen. Let's face it, there's lots of different devices using the same chipset out there these days, so there's really got to be something to help differentiate one from another. And in this case, the screen really helps this one stand out, along with its size, shape, and build quality, which we'll talk about shortly. When it comes to performance, I'm just not going to waste a lot of time on it here. This is a mid-range device with a mid-range price. Depending on the model you buy, you're looking at between $65 and $100. The only differentiator in price is what you're buying it with. In this case, whether you get it with or without a secondary ROM memory card and how big that card is. As you guys probably know from some of my other videos, I'm not thrilled that ROMs are included with these things, and I don't think this party is going to last forever. They probably should not include ROMs. Anywho, performance is basically the same as all the other devices using the same H700 chipset. You'll be able to run essentially everything from the 16-bit era and below just fine, minus a few arcade titles. PlayStation and Game Boy Advance are basically going to be fine on here too. I mean, if you've seen any review covering any of the devices using this chipset, you know what to expect. You'll also get some games that perform okay from newer generations, stuff that you'll find on the N64, Dreamcast, and PSP, for example. And for all these devices that look like a Game Boy, well, I think a lot of people want to see what Game Boy games look like up and running on them, so here you go. As I mentioned, I'm using the stock operating system and stock settings, including filters and bezels. So what you're seeing now is what you get out of the box without you having to mess around with a single setting. And yeah, you can see these games look great. The screen is crystal clear, and probably the single best 640 by 480 panel I've ever seen. I was really impressed with it. I'll show you a little montage of other systems and the name of each game and system while I go through the rest of the info here in this review. So the 40XXV is really great if you want to relive the feeling of holding a Game Boy in your hands, while playing classic games on a much better screen than the original with a built-in rechargeable battery. And you're obviously not limited to Game Boy or portable games only. I mean, you can play all the systems you'd expect to just fine on here. So if you want to play NES games, Sega Master System, Genesis, SNES, PC Engine, Game Gear, Lynx, or old Atari systems, loads of arcade games, and others, you're pretty much set. All that stuff will work really well with the default settings in the stock operating system, as long as you launch the games from RetroArch and not the Games Room feature. Much like on the 35XXSP, if you launch the games from the Games Room option in the menu, you'll be in for a deeply unpleasant experience. Many games that should run fine will have very obvious frame skipping, and many have pretty ugly filters applied to them. And I'm not sure which default emulators they're using, but stuff like Strider here just features tons of gameplay abnormalities that you won't encounter in most modern emulators. So my advice is stay away from Games Room, don't use it. If you use RetroArch, which is the second menu option here, everything works much better by default. Now, I'm not a huge fan of bezels. For most systems, I just left them on though, since when testing this, I wanted to have that full stock experience with the device. Every now and then though, I'd turn them off, which you can easily do in settings. You can do it as a one-time setting or permanently change settings on the device itself if you want, just up to you and what you prefer. And as you've seen from this segment, lots of games run really well on this system, which again is no surprise considering the history of the chipset. Now let's talk about these controls a little more. So the D-pad is a little bit stiff, but it has an actual pivot and is vastly superior to the one on the 35XXSP and most other Anbernic devices. Now, if the SP is your only Anbernic device, you'll be surprised at how much better the D-pad on the 40XXV is. Now, I wish it were a little bit looser, maybe more like a Sega-style D-pad like we'd find on the Anbernic RG Arc, but what's here is fine and very usable. The face buttons also feel great. The analog stick is, well, not so hot. The range is much more limited than it should be, and it seems like it's just mimicking the D-pad using digital on-off signals instead of an analog range. You'll see this in the System's I/O test app, and you'll feel it in games where you use it. Still, it's handy to have the thumbstick here. Since the D-pad is a little bit on the stiff side, I've noticed that it fatigues my thumb pretty quickly during shooters or anything where I have to hold it down for long periods of time in one direction. But using the thumbstick instead is a great alternative in those scenarios. Now, I wouldn't use the analog stick for Street Fighter or anything like that, but it's fine for a lot of other game types. These shoulder buttons are okay. They're fine, even though the positioning isn't fantastic. With this form factor, I feel like Anbernic did about the best job that anyone could have done with them. And for the types of games I've been playing most of the time on this, access to the shoulder buttons hasn't been a concern, since I've mostly felt like playing older portable and 8-bit stuff. But PlayStation fans should be aware, it may feel a smidge awkward to reach around the back of this thing and use all 4 triggers for games that require them. And I don't want to paint a bad picture here. On the whole, the controls on the 40XXV are really good. And if all you've got is an Anbernic SP, these are a huge improvement over those. They aren't quite as good as what you'll find on higher-end, pricier systems, but for this price range, the controls are totally fine, except for the analog stick. Battery life is pretty good here and just about on target for what's advertised. Anbernic claims 6 hours of battery life, and in my testing with a variety of older systems, yeah, that's pretty close to exactly what I've gotten out of it. Will it get less if you're mostly playing higher-end stuff like Dreamcast and Naomi games on it? Almost definitely. So that's something to consider. But even mixing some of those games in, I don't think I've had this device ever last fewer than 5 hours on a charge in the roughly 1 week of testing I've done for this review. I've charged it about 5 times during that period. The interface here is the same as what you'll find on other recent Anbernic devices, although it does seem like some options have been removed. Standby time has been decent and seems to be better than the default standby time you get out of the stock operating system on the SP, for example. And I want to hype the screen just one more time here, folks. Here is the 40XXV next to the SP. I don't know how this is going to come out on video, but the color depth and richness is just vastly superior on the 40XXV. This screen just really looks great, and I really like it. It's definitely the standout feature on this device as a whole. Build quality on the 40XXV is definitely also a step up from many of the other Anbernic devices I've tried. It feels a lot more solid, and the components are higher quality all around. This just feels like a much nicer device than something like the 35XXSP, and frankly is a lot easier to recommend than that one, which was awesome for nostalgia, but left something to be desired when it came to build quality, controls, and the screen. None of those things are a concern on the 40XXV. You'll also get Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on the 40XXV, so if you want to do things like retro achievements and easily scrape your own ROMs for box art and stuff, that's an available option. I should probably also mention that you've got RGB lighting around the base of the analog stick if that's your thing, and you have a lot of controls to tweak what it looks like. Finally, while I told you this review would cover the stock experience, I also do want you to know that you have other options. Some popular ones include Newly and UOS or MUOS, however you say that. If you want to mess around with those and replace the stock OS, hey, knock yourself out, you can do that right now. I have seen some complaints that Newly currently still has some issues and some systems perform worse with it than they do with stock, but most people seem pretty happy with MUOS. I may do a video on some of these alternative operating systems down the road, but I'm not sure if I'm going to do that yet. Alright, time to wrap things up here and give you my review score and recommendation for the RG40XXV. On the positive end of the spectrum, the screen on the RG40XXV is absolutely gorgeous for a device in this form factor at this 640 by 480 resolution. Absolutely awesome, I would say. The controls are good, but the D-pad is a little bit stiff, and the analog stick doesn't feel very analog if it is at all. As with other devices with this same chipset, you'll be good for games in the 16-bit era and below on home systems, and then you'll also get PlayStation and GBA support. For anything beyond that, like N64 and Dreamcast, you can expect spotty performance, where some things will run fine and some things won't, and you may notice some things running with a lot of frame skip. So that's all going to depend on the game you're running when it comes to those higher-end systems, which is the norm for devices in this power range. Now, the original Game Boy style of this device is pretty snazzy, even though we've seen this form factor a number of times before from Anbernic and other companies like Miu. And as for the price range between $65 and $100 depending on your configuration, it's a pretty good deal for what you get power-wise. The build quality is also better than many other devices in this same price range from Anbernic. Now on the downside, you have that analog stick performance, battery life that could be a little better. I'd say the fact that it only has one front-firing mono speaker is also a downside, even though the mono speaker is pretty good. And of course the whole ROM situation. I would also personally prefer that the D-pad was a little less stiff. But right now that's pretty much it for the downsides on this device. Overall, this was a pretty nice little device all things considered, and I had a pretty pleasant experience using it. I'm giving the Anbernic RG40XXV a final review score of 8 out of 10. I really like this device, and frankly it surprised me a little bit, considering I was very familiar with the hardware. The 40XXV is well put together, and if your only other Anbernic device is that really popular 35XXSP, I feel like this is a big step up when it comes to build quality and playability. When all is said and done, should you buy one? Well, here's what I have to recommend on that front. If you don't already have a handheld emulation device and you want to jump in with something mid-range and you really like the Game Boy form factor, you'll probably love the 40XXV. If you already have a bunch of other emulation handhelds, what then? Well, that's where things get a little trickier. It's really going to depend on what you want and what personally makes you happy with devices like this. As someone who owns a bunch of handhelds myself, I think that this one is worth it for the screen and some of the novelty it provides, because I don't really have any other devices in the original Game Boy form factor. For me, if I want the Game Boy experience, this is probably the handheld I'll go to. Now, if either of those scenarios I just mentioned apply to you, well then this may just be your device. Now, if you've already got a bunch of devices in this form factor, then it's hard to recommend unless you just want to collect them all and see what the differences are like between them. But if you don't have anything at all yet, or you just don't have anything shaped like a Game Boy, this one is easy to recommend. Alright folks, your turn. Tell me what you think. Do you already have the RG40XXV? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you have any of the numerous other Anbernic devices but are considering this one? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi, or you can even do it right here on YouTube channel memberships with stuff like Super Thanks. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.